Welcome back to the Invest Smarter podcast. I am so excited about today's guest, Jimmy Song. Jimmy has a huge following in the world of Bitcoin, and it's for great reason because he knows Bitcoin inside and out. He's by far the most knowledgeable person I've ever talked to about Bitcoin, and he's also just plain entertaining and really interesting to listen to. His latest book called Thank God for Bitcoin talks all about the morality of Bitcoin and the immorality of the current financial system, and it's so interesting. And namely, he's talking about the immorality of fiat currency, and we get some really interesting historical tidbits too about fiat, where he refers to World War I, which I thought was so fascinating. And admittedly, being a Bitcoin noob myself, we do start off slow. I ask him, what is Bitcoin? Can you explain it for me? I've had it explained to me in many different ways, and I'm still just learning. And I thought his explanation was probably the best I've ever heard. I also have him debunk some of the most common criticisms that I hear against Bitcoin, like for instance, it wastes energy or it has no inherent value. And then we get into why the current financial system is corrupt, immoral, built on credit, and not sustainable. And then of course we get into Thank God for Bitcoin, his latest book, which I'm definitely buying. It's actually on the way right now because it just seems like such a fascinating topic. I've never heard of Bitcoin being spoken to as something that is inherently moral, but he does believe this, and he believes that Bitcoin is what will be the standard global currency ultimately, and that it will be a great thing for humanity. I really cannot wait to dive in. But first, quick housekeeping item. I want to let you know that we at Deutsche Capital will be holding our second webinar ever, and that'll be on September 23rd at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on the exciting topic of tax planning in retirement. Check out the link in the show notes to register. You can also just head on over to DeWittCM/taxes. I hope to see you there. I think we will add some solid value. And okay, that's enough of that. Let's get into this interview. I really hope you enjoy it. I know I did. Jimmy Song, welcome to the podcast. I'm pretty pumped to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's going to be great, I think.
I think it's going to be great as well. I have been looking into your Twitter and just some of your podcasts and some other podcasts you've done. And one thing I kept seeing is that you're a Bitcoin maximalist. And so right off the bat, why don't we just figure out what that is? Because that's the first time I've heard of that. So what does that mean?
Well, the term was coined by Vitalik Buterin, who's the creator of Ethereum about 4 years ago. And it was meant to be sort of like a way to put down Bitcoiners and say, oh, these guys are Bitcoin maximalists, or they don't think altcoins are legit. And we kind of ran with it as a community. Basically, what it means is that a Bitcoin maximalist thinks that Bitcoin actually has a legitimate use case, and all these altcoins like Ethereum, Ripple, Bitcoin Cash, and
like Dogecoin.
Dogecoin. Yeah, all of them have no real utility. That they are mostly used as a speculative frenzy to essentially scam people out of their money. And unfortunately, a lot of people tend to lump Bitcoiners and altcoiners together. And that's something that Bitcoin maximalists tend to fight against. And this, by the way, may be the subject of my next book.
So sort of meant to be an insult, but you guys have embraced it and own it. I love that.
Yes, that's right.
Awesome. So you like Bitcoin and you're not a big fan of the others.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Good to know. All right. So now I think you've been in this space for a while. So why don't we just quickly talk about how you even got into Bitcoin in the first place, and what has your relationship been with it? Like, what have you done with Bitcoin? Mm-hmm. So I know you have some programming background.
Yes. So I've been a programmer pretty much all my life, but I started doing it professionally right out of college back in 1998. And, my first job was at a startup, and I've been doing startups pretty much like my entire life. Back in 2011, I was working at one of these startups, and I came across an article where I didn't know anything. And it was on a website called Slashdot. And if you're a computer programmer like me, those are the sites that you go to, because it has all sorts of tech news about what's going on. The latest Linux distro, here are some patent trolls that are trying to patent something stupid. Here's the new MacBook and, the specs around it. And here's a new chip and things like that. But there was one story on there of which I knew absolutely nothing, and it intrigued me. It said Bitcoin has reached dollar parity. So I was like, what does that even mean? And how do you reach dollar parity? It didn't even occur to me that it could be a currency, and I couldn't parse the sentence. So after I looked into it and read the story and started getting curious, I found out very quickly that it had a 21 million limit. That's been true, since the beginning of Bitcoin, that there will never, ever be more than 21 million Bitcoins. And that immediately triggered in me an instinct to go get some of it, because I understood, at least vaguely, how it worked. Of course, I understand it a lot better now, but that this digital scarcity could actually be enforced. And that was my first exposure to Bitcoin. Unfortunately, I didn't actually buy Bitcoin at that point. The dollar parity basically meant that Bitcoin had reached $1. Of course, it's a lot more than that now. And one of the big regrets of my life is not buying more Bitcoin when I first heard of it. I did eventually buy some, and I started programming, for Bitcoin open source projects in 2013 as a programmer. That led me to get some jobs in the Bitcoin space as a startup programmer. And I did that for 3 different startups. And eventually I ended up, finding out that I happen to be pretty good at teaching other developers about Bitcoin, because one of the first things that each of those companies made me do was go teach their developers what Bitcoin actually is, because I had done the hard work of actually figuring that out. And I tried to present it in a reasonable way that led me to do my seminar called Programming Blockchain, where I teach Bitcoin developers about Bitcoin and all of the technical underpinnings and so on, which essentially got formed into my first book, Programming Bitcoin, which is published by O'Reilly. And if anyone in your audience is technical, that is sort of the premier technical publisher for anything in the United States, and that's who it's published with. I got to teach a graduate level class at the University of Texas with essentially the same material. I've invested in several startups. I've been an advisor at several startups. I've written 2 other books since then. One, the Little Bitcoin book, which is a basic overview of Bitcoin for those that don't know about it, and Thank God for Bitcoin, which is the moral argument for Bitcoin.
Yeah, and that book I want to get into in a little bit. It seems to me to be like the most intriguing thing that I've read about recently about Bitcoin. But first, let's just still cover sort of some of the groundwork here. So you said that you got good at explaining Bitcoin or having people understand it. So how about you help people who are very much the layperson understand it?
Sure. The easiest way to think about Bitcoin is as digital gold. Gold for a long time was used as money, I think somewhere around 5,000 years. And Bitcoin shares many of its characteristics. For example, no one will arrest you if you're digging in your backyard for gold. But if you're in the basement printing $100 bills, the Secret Service can and probably will arrest you for making counterfeit money. There's no permission required to go and gather Bitcoin, just like there's no permission required to gather gold, especially on property that you own. That in that sense, it's decentralized versus centralized. Centralized usually means that there's permission required somewhere, and the current system of money very much requires permission. So the monetary system is based on, what we would call central bank backed currency. It used to be backed by gold until 1971, almost exactly 50 years ago. I think we celebrated the anniversary like 3 days ago. It used to be backed by gold, but 50 years ago, Richard Nixon cut the ties to gold by temporarily suspending its convertibility. And that means that it's no longer backed by gold. It is literally fiat money. It is fiat in Latin means let it be done. The first verse of the Bible is fiat lux, let there be light. And it is just money created out of nothing, ex nihilo. God can obviously do that, but not man. And so in a sense, it's money created out of nothing. And it's in stark contrast with Bitcoin, which is a lot more like gold. But much like fiat currency, the reason why the dollar exists is because it's a lot easier to spend across space. So if you try to right now, pay somebody in physical gold, you would actually have to physically deliver the gold, which is very inconvenient versus what you can do now, which is, pay via credit card and have the digital transaction online. You don't need to be in the same place, and you can get goods shipped from all around the world very easily as a result. So Bitcoin gives you sort of like the best of both worlds. It has sort of the decentralized nature of gold, which is not subject to, government debasement and many other things, government confiscation, government censorship, and all these other things. But at the same time, it's digital. So it has all of the advantages of the dollar, which is that you can quickly spend it and be able to transact with people, all around the world. And I would argue that it's actually better than gold in its scarcity and its ability to preserve value. And it's better than the dollar in its ability to transmit across space without any third party involved.
Okay, I think that is a pretty good way of putting it. At least I can understand that. So that's job well done. Now, and the scarcity thing, I mean, that's the one thing that I always come back to because, what creates, value? I mean, you have to have some level of scarcity. I mean, it's just economics. So, and I guess we don't really know how much gold actually does exist, but we know exactly how much Bitcoin can exist. So I guess that is a good thing. Now, there's always so many arguments from usually older people that just don't understand Bitcoin, and they come up with things to say, Bitcoin sucks for this or that reason. So why don't we go quickly and just go through a couple that I always hear, and let's see, I want to see what you say. So the one that I always hear the most is that there's no inherent value. It's just a number on a computer created from nothing. So what would you say?
Well, so there's no inherent value in anything, really. If you think about it, it's only what value we give to it. So, like iron, for example, has no value until people figured out how to make tools out of it or weapons out of it. And it's value that is like all value essentially is subjective. It's not, there's no objective inherent value to anything. Now, the fact that you can make something out of that iron, it does give it utility. And for people that know how to do that, but for you or me, or I assume you're not an ironsmith, that don't know what to do with like a piece of rock that has some iron in it. It's kind of useless. Maybe you can use it as a paperweight or something like that. But for the most part, it doesn't have quote unquote inherent value either. All value is subjective. So that means that, digital things can have value, especially if they have scarcity. And, anyone that's younger, they tend to get it a lot faster because, maybe they've played World of Warcraft or something like that, where you have digital objects that are worth quite a bit of money. The thing that I would point out to older folks is that the US dollar is exactly the same way. Most, something like 97% of all US dollars are not in the form of bills or coins. They're actually just and ledger entries on some bank's database. So really, you're doing the same thing and saying the same thing about the dollar already. So when you say, okay, it has no inherent value, well, then you pretty much have give me your bank balance, because that also has no inherent value, and I'll give you a rock for it or something like that. So. Yeah, digital things definitely can have value, and that's because all value is subjective and it's based on what other people will pay for it.
Yeah, that was a great answer. I actually totally agree with you. I mean, everything that even stocks, I mean, it's a coming together of humans putting a value on something. So since we are all humans interacting in this world, we are subjectively assigning value to pretty much everything. That's great. Now, the other one I hear, and there's a lot of people out there that are holding up signs and protesting, it's terrible for the government. I've heard that it uses as much energy as certain countries. It uses as much energy as, 23 coal-fired plants a year, all that kind of thing. So, I mean, isn't Bitcoin just awful for the environment and we should just not be doing it at all?
So there's a lot of articles that have been written on this. The latest takedown I thought was absolutely brilliant. It's by Lynn Alden. You can look up why Bitcoin energy consumption is not a problem. But very briefly, this is based on sort of like a complete misunderstanding of how the energy market works and how Bitcoin sort of like draws energy. The energy that the Bitcoin mining is using is not the same energy that your dishwasher is using. And that's a little bit of a hard concept to understand because people tend to think electricity is electricity. But that's not it at all. In fact, electricity is highly non-fungible, which is why in certain countries where there aren't that many energy sources, you pay upwards of 35 cents per kilowatt hour. Whereas in very cheap places where there's an abundant amount of energy, you pay like 2 cents per kilowatt hour. The difference is in, energy production and many other things. But more to the point, the entire energy market is optimized for availability. And by that, what I mean is when you turn on your lights, it should come on every single time, right? Like that's what the energy company wants, is that when you are ready to consume energy, that it is available for you. It's kind of like the rental car market in that respect. If you go to the rental car counter and they have no cars for you, that's a terrible customer experience, and you're probably not going to go back there again. What they want to do is make sure that it's available whenever you have need of it. And if it's not available, you're not going to like the company and switch and so on. Although for most public utilities like that's not how it is. So in order to make sure that it's available, what energy companies do is they always build out for peak demand. So here in Austin, where I am, that tends to be during the summer when everyone is running their ACs on full blast. And whatever the peak demand is, maybe it's like 3 p.m. on July 7th or something like that. They build out the energy capacity so that you have at least that much every single day of the year. And that's good because that means that whenever you turn on your lights, it'll come on and so on. But that also means that there's a lot of waste because you're generating enough energy to fulfill peak demand, but most of the time you're nowhere near peak demand. And September 5th or something like that, when it's neither too hot nor too cold, you're not going to just use that much energy. So as a result, you have all of this excess energy that gets wasted. In fact, something like a third of all electricity generated around the world gets wasted precisely for this reason. It's kind of like rental car capacity, right? Not all of those cars are driven all of the time. It's only, in fact, most of them sit on lots for a majority of their life. So energy is kind of like that. And what Bitcoin does, it has this unique feature where you could turn it off whenever you want. You don't really care to have it running all the time, especially if somebody is paying you to turn it off. And this is essentially what happens with a lot of these power contracts that these miners use, is they consume the electricity that would otherwise be wasted. And that means that for these electricity providers, it gives them, it essentially gives them revenue where they would otherwise be wasting money, and that subsidizes their energy production. So, this could be everything from oil and gas to, stuff like green energy, where you're subsidizing in some way, especially like intermittent sources of energy like wind or solar. You're essentially able to, sell this energy to miners that are always ready to buy, essentially, and can consume at your schedule instead of the schedule of the customer. So it's based on a completely flawed understanding of the energy market, and it's saying, okay, well, this country uses this much, and I mean, like Lynn Alden's article points out that stuff like zinc production and running dryers take up way more electricity than Bitcoin does. So, I mean, if you're going to moralize about Bitcoin's energy use, you should also moralize about that. Do you really need zinc in your life? Do you really need to dry your clothes in a dryer? Why don't you dry them outside, you electricity hoarding person? It's a false argument, and I don't think people really understand how energy actually works.
Yeah, I sympathize with you because, I mean, there's always the hypocritical nature of it where it's like, well, how did you drive to your protest today? And what were you using? I mean, it's like everyone's using petroleum and fossil fuels in one way or the other. So, I mean, if you cut it all out of your life, you'll basically be living in a tent in your backyard. Hopefully you find some animals to farm and eat and all that. So, I don't know. I've spoken to Alex Epstein about this, and he's like, well, most of the solar panels and wind turbines that you build, they're all made from fossil fuel. So it's not like you're
the energy required to produce those things is all fossil fuel. So you're converting one form of energy to a production of another, and it's more intermittent and less stable. So yeah, there's a lot of hypocrisy in this whole thing.
There's a lot of, there was the one energy CEO who put up the billboard that said, because North Face was saying that they're going to like stop something with fossil fuels. They're going to stop doing something or other. And an energy company put up a billboard that said, "Thank you, North Face, for being one of our biggest customers." Because they make their plastic puffers out of petroleum. So it's like, it's just crazy. It's just crazy how it goes. All right. So
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's funny. And then the one thing I always hear is that crypto's in a big bubble. And then also there's going to be so many new coins, and that's going to dilute the demand and, flooding the market with more supply. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that Bitcoin is not altcoins, and those two things are very different. And the supply of altcoins is absolutely correct. They do expand very quickly, and the amounts in each one are like more. It can expand infinitely, basically. I think back when I started, there were only like 10 altcoins, something like that. Currently on CoinMarketCap alone, there's about 10,000 listed. There's probably a lot more that people don't know about that exist as well. So, that supply is expanding, but Bitcoin is 21 million. And if you measure the returns of these altcoins against Bitcoin, you find that they all do terribly, that they're like at a very small fraction of their all-time high against Bitcoin. Typically, whenever the frenzy for that coin happened to be. And, they go up and down, and they have different issuance schedules. And we can get into exactly how altcoins are different from Bitcoin in general. But the volatility around all of that is due to Bitcoin's volatility. Everything follows Bitcoin. So when Bitcoin goes up, it tends to go up a little less. When Bitcoin goes down, all those altcoins tend to go down a little more, which is how you get like negative returns against Bitcoin if you held, for example, Ripple from December of 2017, something like that. It's gone down significantly against Bitcoin. But the reason why Bitcoin is volatile is because it's just sort of like natural volatility. If you understand like how other central banks work. So, for example, typically what the examples people give are like the euro, the yen, the yuan, something like that, other currencies which are relatively stable to the dollar. So, for example, the euro has been plus or minus 1.2 dollars per euro for the last 20 years, which is pretty much all of its existence. I think, for a short time there, it was below $1 and stuff like that, but it's not too far off. The Japanese yen, since the 80s or something like that, has been around 100 yen per dollar for most of its life. And many other currencies are similarly like that. The reason why they're so stable is because of the existence of a central bank. And what the central banks of all of these countries do is, as it gets too high, it'll print more of its own currency to keep it stable against the dollar. And as it gets too low, it'll sell some of its treasuries to buy back its own currency. Usually, this is why most of them keep U.S. dollars in their reserve in the form of U.S. treasuries, and sell those treasuries to buy back their own currency to lift it back up. And the reason why they do that is because they want stability in terms of their currency to the dollar. And that allows exports to not be too expensive and imports to also not be too expensive. So it's this delicate balance that these central banks are performing by selling treasuries or printing more of their own money. So all of that is to say that what all of these currencies that are more stable against the dollar do is they centrally manage the volatility away. Bitcoin does not have a central bank. It's completely decentralized. It has no central organization that's making that happen. So it has much more of a natural volatility. But that natural volatility is actually a good thing because it's what gives it the upside. The volatility and upside are two sides of the same coin. If you don't have that volatility, then you also don't get those returns. And and that's something that a lot of people don't recognize. The reason why bond markets have almost no yield right now is because central banks have essentially de-risked them of everything. But once you de-risk it, you also de-risk the return. Like there's nobody that's actually making that much money off of bonds, and you get like crazy stuff like negative rates in Europe and so on. Ultimately, what the volatility in Bitcoin is okay. I don't think it's a bubble. Like people compare it to tulips or something like that. You look at the tulip bubble; it had one bubble and it dropped. Bitcoin has gone through 5 bubbles that I've observed in the last 10 years, right? Like 2011, it went from $1 to $30, back down to $2. In 2013, it went from $10 to $2.66, back down to $50. In 2013 again, it went from 100 to 1,100 and back down to 200. And in 2017, it went from 200 to 19. It went from 1,000 to 19,000 and back down to 3,000. And, this time again, it went from 3,000 to, 65,000 back down to, 27,000. So like, this is, if it's a tulip bubble, this is like, you can't call it that because it's not a one-time thing and coming back down. That's the pattern of pretty much every altcoin, but it is not the pattern for Bitcoin.
Right. So it's generating more and more price history, which has also been one of the arguments against it. So as we keep going on, right, it's generating more and more of a track record. So I guess that argument is getting deflated. Now, what is your thought on Bitcoin being actually practical in terms of being an actual medium of exchange? So you think it's like a great money, but do you think it's a great money for using to have in your wallet to buy things given the volatility? Because one day it might be better to buy something with it, and one day it might be a worse idea to buy something with it.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And there are two sort of aspects to it, which is, can it handle the capacity, which I can talk about with the Lightning Network, I think. But I think the more deeper question is, well, how are you going to buy stuff if it's like, $65,000 one day and $27,000 the next? And, it gets the volatility there makes buying anything kind of difficult. So that part, I think I can answer a little bit better. Until we are on a Bitcoin standard, generally what people are going to want to do is to save money in Bitcoin and not spend it. Every holder that I've known, that has held Bitcoin for any number of years, they regret every purchase that they've ever made with Bitcoin. So the story I usually tell is back in 2013, I bought some beef jerky because there was an online store that sold beef jerky for Bitcoin. I bought $100 of Bitcoin, $100 worth of beef jerky with Bitcoin. And at the time, Bitcoin was $400 per Bitcoin. Now, that was pretty good beef jerky, but a quarter of a Bitcoin now is worth over $10,000. So it wasn't $10,000 good. And this is why, most people will prefer to save instead of spend. Now, eventually you get to a point where, the inflating currency, and this in our case is the US dollar, is not really desired by merchants. So this happens in hyperinflating economies. I think the most recent example I can give is Venezuela. If you go to the black market in Venezuela, not like the state ones, which are always running out of food because people want to spend their bolivars as quickly as possible. But the black market, generally, you're not going to be able to get merchants to take bolivars, and if you do, then they're going to charge a premium because it's inflating away so quickly. Instead, they're going to demand dollars, and I think this is what will eventually happen. Though maybe not in the United States, it'll probably be the last place to come under a Bitcoin standard. But in places like Nigeria and Lebanon and so on, you're kind of running into a similar problem where if you're, trading your goods and services for the Nigerian naira, for example, it's inflating away pretty quickly. And instead of saving in that currency, You want to receive in Bitcoin instead. And not surprisingly, Nigeria is one of the places in the world where Bitcoin adoption is absolutely exploding. It's one of the fastest growing markets for it. Places like Turkey and Lebanon are also adopting Bitcoin. And my friend Alex Gladstein just wrote about how it's becoming a thing in Cuba, despite their authoritarian nature.
Okay, so the countries and the places that have the least, where the citizens have the least faith in their government and their dollar and currency, that's where you're kind of seeing the most adoption, because there's something here that's an alternative that you don't need trust from someone. You can just rely on the Bitcoin. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah. And this is the crazy thing that a lot of people don't know. Like, the dollar is used absolutely everywhere because it is sort of like the global reserve currency. So my friend Timia Bijoué, who wrote the Little Bitcoin book with me, he's Nigerian and grew up there all his life. And we were talking about the dollar, and and we were saying, the dollar isn't that important to Nigerians or people in the third world. He's like, no, this is the most important currency in my entire life. Like, it was way more important than the Naira growing up, because that's what we saved our money in. And that's the case everywhere, including places that you wouldn't expect, like North Korea. In the black markets in North Korea, the dollar is the most desired currency out of anything, because it is the most liquid and it is the most quote unquote stable. And of course, those are the people that are feeling the effects of inflation the most. Apparently prices in the North Korean black markets have doubled, and they're like, what happened? Well, yeah, the Federal Reserve has expanded the money supply by 40% in the last year. That's what happened. And you're the first ones to feel it, because, goods are getting scarcer and things are costing more.
So do you foresee like a potential future, like probably, decades down the road, where it's like the dollar is the last standing sort of like established currency, and it's versus like Bitcoin? Like, is that sort of some sort of potential like crazy future?
Yeah, I don't know if it's decades away or 5 years away or whatever, but generally what happens in hyperinflating economies is that it's a very slow burn until all of a sudden it goes crazy. So if you study the Weimar Republic, for example, like inflation was like kind of reasonable right up until like 1922. And then 1923, absolutely everything went crazy. And in a single month, you had like, 10,000% inflation or something like that. We're kind of seeing that now with like goods and shortages. I mean, I went to Costco yesterday, and I noticed like the prices on absolutely everything was up like 50% compared to like even just a couple of years ago. Stuff like beef, stuff like, bacon, milk, everything is, like, we're starting to see it. And typically for people on the ground that don't necessarily know what's going on, this is a little bit of a shock, but then they get used to it, and they expect things to turn around any minute now, but it never does. And that's usually how things kind of collapse. This is how Rome collapsed, although this happened over centuries, because coin debasement was much slower than Federal Reserve monetary expansion, which is extremely fast. So it tends to affect the economy much faster. So I expect this to take shorter, and it'll be very gradual and then extremely sudden, and it'll collapse in sort of like a blink of an eye, relatively speaking.
So do you think it relies upon like the US dollar actually like collapsing?
I think eventually it will, because there is this alternative available, which is like hard, scarce money. And that, like, it might take decades, like you said, but it'll be gradual and then sudden. The thing a lot of people don't understand about the US dollar is that, it is the global reserve currency, but it doesn't have sort of like a right to it or a natural reason for it. The reason why we have that is, one, partly due to weird historical factors at the end of World War II. Essentially, the U.S. had a large amount of the world's gold supply inside its borders, and the fact that we have the biggest military in the world. Now, like that sort of secures a lot of it, and we can enforce the petrodollar system all over the world as a result. But the US dollar doesn't have to be the reserve currency for the world. It doesn't have to be sort of like the settlement for international trade, which I think something like 90% of all international trade gets settled in the dollar. Well, that's the case. it doesn't have to be that way. The British pound and I forget the Portuguese, some other currency, but they used to be world reserve currencies too, and they lasted about 100 years and then collapsed. Where I guess if you count from Bretton Woods, we've been the world reserve currency for something like 80 years, and it doesn't have to last much longer than that, and it's entirely possible that we get a newer, better one.
Yeah, and going back to what you said before, like now it's been 50 years of the US dollar as fiat. I mean, it's not that long now that I'm thinking about it. And to me, is it like kind of like an experiment that we just don't know what the ending is?
Well, we kind of do, because there's been a lot of economies which had fiat money. The average lifespan, in fact, of fiat money is 26 years. So 50 years is actually kind of like double the length of most fiat currencies. The oldest one, by the way, is the Bank of England and the British pound, but it's been debased like crazy since its inception, I think in the 1690s, something like that. So that one's over 300 years old. But, most other ones, they collapse, and it's usually due to hyperinflation of some kind. And
reckless government spending, perhaps?
Yeah, that's definitely a part of it, but it's not just government; it's companies and individuals too. And especially in a central bank-backed fiat currency like we have, what you get is the ability for pretty much at every level to expand the money. So the federal government can take out loans that it doesn't repay for a long time, right? Like that expands the money supply. So, for example, it has a budget of 6 trillion and it only gets 4 trillion in tax revenue. What do you do with the extra 2 trillion that you need? Well, you sell some to the public, to other central banks, though no other central bank is really buying US treasuries right now. So it's really only a few private investors, most of which realize that it's a scam, so aren't buying either. So what you get is the lender of last resort, which is the Federal Reserve, buying $2 trillion of US treasuries and creating money out of thin air in order to do so. So that's one form of expansion. And we had something like 5 trillion of that in the last year. The other form of expansion is through loans on the commercial lending market. So if you are a business and you want like a cheap loan, this is what you do. You go to, you issue your own bond, and a lot of banks will buy your bond. And the way the banks buy the bond is by, again, creating a loan out of thin air, and they create money out of thin air and put the asset and liability on their books, and that's it. And it's done that way, which is why these companies can get 1% loans and so on.
So walk me through that. So the person who wants to issue the bond sells it to the bank, but how is the bank like? You mean like a commercial bank?
Yeah. These are commercial banks.
So how does that work? How is the commercial bank? They don't have the printing press.
Yeah. Well, they kind of do. So this is the whole point. All right. So normally what most people think of loans, this is how they think it works. It's that, a bunch of people put money in the bank, right, and give it to the bank for some interest rate, say like 3% or something like that. And then the bank loans out that same money at 5%. And then, when they get paid back, they can pay back the savers at 3% and they pocket the 2%. That's how they think it works. That's not how it works. There's something called fractional reserve banking. So if you have something like, $100,000 in deposits, what you do is you lend out $1 million worth of money. So that expands the monetary supply by $900,000, right? Because there's $900,000 more. And this is how it's done. And the reserve requirement used to be 10%. I think that was instituted under FDR. They basically removed that, so the banks can loan out, with impunity. And it kind of, if you doubt this, just think about like the other side of the trade. A business wants to borrow money, and right now they're getting rates at like 1 or 2%, something like that, right? Who's taking the other side of the trade, right? Like, and they're getting like $100 million. So who's taking the other side of the trade? Who is actually loaning them money at 1% at $100 million, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense at all. Like, no one would ever invest in something like that, especially since there's some risk involved that the company won't repay. Of course, you're the senior creditor, so you're probably going to get paid back. But still, like, that's a terrible use of your money, unless you can get leverage. And leverage is another way to print lots and lots of money, which is what these banks do. And in fact, there's like a 0% reserve requirement for these. So essentially they loan out the money and it's, an entry on their ledger, but it doesn't come from any savings. It comes out of nothing. It's ex nihilo money. And this also happens at the retail level. So whenever you go out and get a mortgage, right now, I think you can get a 30-year mortgage for 3%, something like that. Think about who's on the other side of the trade. Who's willing to lend you, $500,000 at 3% for 30 years, right? Yeah. Like the term is way too long. The risk is way too high and you're not making nearly that much money. There's nobody in the world that would give you that sort of loan. Yet it's happening all day long. Why? Because it's printed into existence. It's created out of nothing instead of out of savings and costing somebody in the form of opportunity cost. It's created out of nothing. This is how the entire banking system works. This is why everyone is up to their eyeballs in debt. This is why you have, like banks are able to issue credit cards with nothing backing them, because all the money that they are loaning you temporarily for the use of your credit card, it's printed out of nothing. It doesn't cost them anything. And especially in the case of home mortgage loans and things like that, there's a federal backstop. It's called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The federal government insures those conforming loans. So there's zero risk to the bank, because if you default, the federal government will bail you out. And for commercial stuff and for bank bailouts and stuff like that, that's exactly what they do too. So there's no risk for any of these people that are really loaning things out or printing money into existence. So, monetary expansion is happening at every level and everyone is incentivized to do it.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy. And I think I absolutely need to understand this better at a later time, because that's fascinating. And I would probably
we cover some of it in Thank God for Bitcoin, but yeah, like this is one of the things about money that like a lot of people don't get, is that the current monetary system is all based on credit, and like credit is extended. And, this was done in the olden days when, you had a shop owner. I'm not getting paid until next Tuesday. All right, well, I'll just extend you credit and give you this thing. Instead, it's extending instead of extending goods temporarily, they're extending money temporarily, except that temporarily is essentially forever, because the debt level continues to expand. So, all of the money in the world just keeps expanding as more and more loans are, given out, more bonds are issued, and more mortgages are made, and things like that. This is how the dollar, every central bank around the world works.
All right, so you've explained a bunch of ways why the financial system is kind of broken. Now, why is this happening? And is like, it seems like it's almost corrupt. Like, are there people who are incentivized to have this all happen? Like, where is the corruption in all of this? Where is it located?
Well, the corruption is that every time you do this, you're essentially stealing from everybody else. And this is the dirty secret of fiat money. If you go back in history, the real sort of starting point for fiat money, at least as a global thing, was World War I. And the thing about World War I is it was an extraordinary war in more ways than one. Usually wars before that ended fairly soon after they started. Why? Because they were extremely expensive. To wage a war for a long time required a lot of resources. And in order to do that for a government, you have to go and tax people. So soldiers are not going to take IOUs, right? They want like money. And if you don't give them money, then they're going to quit, and you're not going to have an army to wage the war and so on. So they would have to actually explicitly tax the populace, which made wars extremely unpopular. As soon as you start the war and then people have to count the cost, they don't like it. And that's been the case for a long time. What changed in World War I was that governments had central banks to be able to escalate the war without having to do explicit taxation. So every country in World War I essentially expanded the money supply continually. Now, what does that effectively do? When you expand the money supply, you're essentially stealing from people. This is what we call in the book stealth taxation. You can steal the resources of everyone using that currency by diluting the savings that they have. And this is essentially what every single one of those countries did. And this is like historically why World War I was so different than every war that came before it. It was total war. It was a war that started as something actually fairly minor, right? Like Serbian separatists murdered the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It wasn't like that big a deal. Somehow it blew up into this thing. It's because everyone could escalate without any repercussions. They can just, essentially tax their entire economy very quickly by expanding the money supply. And that's exactly what they did. And what that effect is essentially stealing the resources of everybody else for the purposes of, war in that case, but for whatever other purpose as well. And that also happened in World War II, where every government essentially expanded the money supply to steal everything from their citizens, and it became total war of destruction instead of suing for peace, which is how most wars ended. And that it devastated the German and Japanese economies as well as a lot of the other economies, even for the victors, for the reason that they essentially taxed their citizens to death without the citizens really knowing that that was what was happening. So ultimately, fiat money and expanding the monetary supply is a form of theft, and it's at least with taxation. A lot of libertarians say taxation is theft. It kind of is, but at least you give some consent to it by voting for it or whatever. With monetary expansion, it's stealth taxation. It's taxation without representation, legislation, or even or any transparency. And what's worse, it taxes every owner of that currency. So you are not just stealing from U.S. citizens. At least we get to vote in a president who appoints the Federal Reserve chairman who can then, set monetary policy. So we have at least an indirect path to having some level of say in what the Federal Reserve does. But think about the people, the black market traders in North Korea or in Venezuela or Zimbabwe or Nigeria or Turkey or Lebanon. Like those people all use the dollar, and we're stealing from them every time we expand the monetary supply. And it's not just the federal government. It's, large businesses that are getting these insanely cheap loans. It's us who are getting mortgages for, extremely cheap rates. We are stealing from them because we are expanding the monetary supply. We are stealing resources from some of the most poor and vulnerable people around the world. And that I think is highly immoral. And that's essentially the case that we make in the book, is that this is theft, like straight up. And it's a system of theft. And, because we're so used to it, we don't recognize it as theft, but it really very much is.
All right, that's really, really fascinating. So we've talked a lot about the immorality. So why don't we? So just we're on to the book now because we're running out of time. Why don't you talk about the book a little bit more? And I want to know a little bit more about the morality of Bitcoin. And I've read somewhere about how it even kind of what's the word I'm trying to say? Like Christians like it. I've read that like Christians are sort of into it potentially or something like that. So what's that all about?
I think Christians should be. And we talk like, Thank God for Bitcoin is the book. And the first 7 chapters don't even really mention the word Bitcoin, right? It is all about the current system and all of the moral shortcomings of the current system. And a lot of the things that you see around today, including the highly divided politics, the complete bitterness and extreme, at least verbal violence that's hurled at each other. It's the result of fiat money. And we make that argument in there. Also, it's very corrupting to our souls. And, the entire fiat monetary system, at least the central bank backed one, is based on loans. And if you think about debt, it is the opposite of the biblical model. The biblical model is sowing then reaping, or saving and then getting what you want, right? That's how it's supposed to be. That's how God designed the world. The debt-based system is exactly the opposite, which is you get to consume now and then be enslaved later. And anyone with kids can tell you what's better, giving the kid the candy now and getting them to promise to take out the garbage for the next 3 weeks or something like that, or doing it the other way where you pay them a small amount for every time they take out the garbage, and then they can get the candy or toy they want at the end of it. What's better for a character? It's the saving and then, getting things at the end instead of getting what you want now and being enslaved later. But, that's the current system that we're all under. We're all up to our eyeballs in debt, getting whatever we want, whenever we want. And then, in return for that, being enslaved essentially to the system, to your debt for a long time. There's a verse in Proverbs that says the debtor is servant to the lender. And there is nothing more a harsh taskmaster than debt. And unfortunately, that's corrupted our souls, corrupted people, corrupted even churches, because a lot of churches go into debt in order to fund these giant buildings and so on. And they become servants to the bank and essentially become landlords over their property to generate more revenue, like doing weddings and preschools and so on, instead of actually doing ministry. So all of that is to say that the current system is highly, highly immoral. And when we talk about Bitcoin, it is in that context that we talk about it, which is that it fixes a lot of these problems that the current system has, which is all based on debt. With Bitcoin, it is all about saving. It is all about sowing and reaping. It is all about actually like building something up instead of consuming something now, and it doesn't have all of these moral hazards that the central bank has of printing money for itself and enriching their cronies in the defense contractor business or whatever in order to enrich their friends. It removes these moral hazards. It becomes Bitcoin is uncensorable essentially. And you have a lot of these properties that make it so that, you have a much better base layer of civilization. And I see money as a base layer. It's a corrupt base layer, and everything that's grown on top of it is also corrupt. Whereas with Bitcoin, it's a lot purer, a lot more moral, a lot more just, and it doesn't have sort of a systematic theft built into it. So it's a lot better, and this is why I think Christians should get into Bitcoin.
And everybody else, because everybody is, because you're right, man. I see so many people that, they drive the fancy car, they have the nice house, but there's just not a whole lot underneath it. There's not a lot of real wealth. It's just everyone's in debt. It's really true. So thank God for Bitcoin. So there's a few ways to interpret that. One way is thank God it exists because it's a way out potentially, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's how I would interpret it. But what's the other interpretation that you were thinking?
The other interpretation, no, it wasn't really interpretation. It was just thank God, because you allude to the Christianity. So you have God in the title. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of an arc to money that's similar to like our arc with sin, right? Like we're all corrupted by sin, and we were created, and then we've been corrupted by sin, and Christ redeems us. And not to like put an analogy there specifically, but there is kind of this really corrupt money, and it needs redemption. It needs to be fixed, and Bitcoin is that fix. And it affects way more things than you would think. And the more you study this stuff, the more you realize a lot of the corruption in the world is because of this bad money. It just incentivizes all of the wrong things, including, like just really impulsive behavior or sinful behavior instead of, thinking towards the future and, building up stuff. So I would say that Bitcoin is the more Christian money and fiat is more the devil's money. So like, maybe that would make sense.
Yeah, that's really very, very fascinating. And I know I'm buying this book now because I think I have a lot to learn about, especially just about how the system works now, because I kind of need to have my eyes wide open about all of this. So yeah, we're running out of time here, but how can people find your book? How can people, sort of stay in touch with what you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm available on Twitter at Jimmy Song. I have a newsletter that I put out every week. It's called Bitcoin Tech Talk, and it is more technical. I am a programmer, and that's my trade. So it's on jimmysong.substack.com. You can subscribe to it. I usually have some articles in there as well that point to what's going on economically, not just technically as well. There's that. You can find my books on Amazon. If you search up my name, Jimmy Song, you can find the 3 books that I've written. I also have a website, programmingbitcoin.com. That's the title of my first book. And, all the stuff that's going on around, the seminars I teach and the books that I've written are all on there as well. So those would be the main ways. But there's, I also have a YouTube channel, Medium blog, and a bunch of other things. But yeah, I don't want to take up too much of that. You can find me on Twitter.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I saw you, you're pretty active on Twitter, so that'll be a good place to start. Yeah, I feel like this could go on forever, but maybe we'll circle back in some months and do this again. But wow, man, your brain is pretty interesting. That was fun.
Thanks.
I really appreciate you coming on, and have a good day.
Thanks.